In the name of God, in this session we want to talk about other terms of typology. Typology, universals, and generative grammar revisited. The description of typological universals and how they are instantiated in the grammars of particular languages given in this chapter bears some resemblance to the notion of parameters and their setting, introduced into generative theory 2 decades after Greenberg's original work in this area. This is another locus of comparison between formal and functional typological approaches to grammar. In principle, any correlation between two syntactic properties that generative grammar explains by an absolute universals or a universal parameter may be formulated as a typological universal and tested. However, formal parameter-based analysis rarely address data in more than a few languages, and typological analysis rarely examine the same syntactic interaction that generativists and other formalists do. This is an area in which more interaction between generative theory and typological theory might be fruitful. Generative syntactic argumentation has produced a large number of cross-construction correlation in English and other languages, which could be surveyed more systematically in the world's languages by typologists. This paragraph doesn't have any important point for your final exam and for your summarization. It was just an introduction to this topic. Gilligan in 1987 bridges this gap to some extent and demonstrates both the opportunities and difficulties of such a comparison. Gilligan conducted a typological study of the Paradra Parameter, a major topic of study in generative grammar in 1980s and early 1990s. Okay, you should know about the Paradra parameters. The Paradra parameter differentiates languages requiring null thematic subjects, unstressed pronoun subjects that are not impersonal, and those permitting null thematic subjects. Compare the grammatical Spanish sentence to the ungrammatical English translation. Okay. Dear student, you should know about the Paradra parameter. What we mean by Paradra parameters? It means that some languages permit to have null thematic subjects like Persian, like Spanish, but some languages don't allow such a null thematic subject like English. It means that in English we must have an object and a subject. But in Spanish and in Persian we can delete the subject and we can mention it through the clitic. But in English, both the subject and the clitic, both of them should appear and exist in the sentence. It is the Paradra parameter. You should know that. Here we can see some example of Spanish, I think, in which in Spanish this sentence is correct and is grammatical and acceptable sentence. And if you look at its translation in English, here we don't have the subject, worked all day. Okay, this is grammatical in Spanish, but this is ungrammatical in English. Here you can see this asterisk. It means that it is not grammatical, because here English is not a Paradra language. the subject must exist in the sentences. A number of proposals in the literature have correlated this distinction with three other binary distinctions: null and non-null, non-semantic, impersonal or explicative subjects, as here, like here, presence and absence of subject inversion, like in 16, presence and absence of that trace violation in 17, all illustrated again with Spanish versus English. Null non-semantic subjects, like here, rain is raining, which is not acceptable in English but is acceptable in Spanish. Even subject inversion, like here, left Mary, which the subject comes at the end of the sentence. It is grammatical in Spanish, but it is ungrammatical in English. And that trace violation is not allowed in English, but here you can see it is allowed in Spanish. Who did you say that left early? In all cases, the Spanish sentences are grammatical and the English equivalents ungrammatical. Okay, therefore, the non-semantic subjects, subject inversion, and that trace violation is acceptable in Spanish, but they are not allowed in English. Gilligan tests the Paradra correlations in a really and genetically balanced 100 language sample. Taking all four properties together, there are 16 possible types. The chief proposals in the literature discussed by Gilligan al-Rizzi in 1982, which predicts three types, which employs three parameters and predicts two additional types. Gilligan's 100 language sample contains 10 languages with data for all four properties. Gilligan adds three more types not in his sample from a survey conducted by van der Ovra in 1984. A comparison of the predictions to the actual data for all four properties is given in table 3.3. As can be seen from the table, there is only a partial match between the types predicted by Rizzi and Saphir and the attested types where data for all four properties are available. Also, most of the predicted types are attested. It means that they exist in languages. Many other types are attested as well. Okay, here we can see in this table the predicted and attested language types for the Paradra parameter. Okay, here we can see the language types and prediction and attestation. When we have the plus, it means that it exists in that language, but minus, it means that they don't exist in that language. All of these features, I mean null-semantic subjects, null-non-semantic subjects, subject inversion, that trace filter violation, and predicted, all of them can exist in one language, and some of them can exist and another one cannot exist in languages. Here we can see them in the languages, which just here we can see 10 of them. Gilligan also examines the Paradra correlations pairwise, which tests the specific correlations predicted by the series of Rizzi and Tolson. Table 3.3 4 shows the hypothesized universals. The strongest valid universal generalizable from Gilligan sample and the number of languages for which data for the universal was available. None of the conditional predictions are borne out by the data, but the one simple implicational universal is, with many languages confirming the implicational universal that the existence of non-semantic subject implies the existence of the non-semantic non-subjects. Gilligan finds simple conditional instead of the 3 biconditional universal proposed by Ritchie and Tolson, but Gilligan's conditional are all problematic. Gilligan argues that exceptions in the literature too, if a language is SI, then it is that, and here you can see some condition in the languages which they are not important. Okay, this example are not important. We can ignore them. Gilligan's analysis makes it appear that the main generative accounts make one prediction for even the data found in their literature. Okay, here you can see the example. SI mean subject inversion, X mean non-semantic subject, and that mean that trace filter violation. This abbreviation stands for this word. Here the universal and evidence for universal pair of Paradra properties, you can see them here. For example, if a language is Paradra, then it is null non-semantic subject, which you can see them in some languages. The table are not important, this table for your final exam. Syntactic analysis can be made to eliminate the counterexamples, and the superficial anomalies are said to mask the deep universals. Regarding the problematic cases of Brazilian, Portuguese, and Mandarin, Gilligan writes, perhaps the Ritchie hypothesis is correct, but its effects are obscured in these languages because of some as yet unanalyzed aspects of these languages. However, to test such an analysis empirically, one must identify the additional syntactic factor and then test its correlation with the Paradra properties cross-linguistically. But if that correlation fails, then other syntactic factors can be proposed by the generative analyst, which must then be tested cross-linguistically and so on. As is frequently stated in generative grammar, it is impossible to prove an analysis incorrect. Rather, it is only possible to improve upon an existing analysis. For example, it is essentially impossible to compare the head ordering word order parameter in generative grammar, which is superficially invalid to the typological word order analysis. We may make some general observation about comparing typological universals and parameter setting accounts. From a typological perspective, the main problem appears to be that not enough variation is accommodated by generative analysis. Counterexamples are too easy to find cross-linguistically, even when additional parameters are proposed to allow more variation. For example, the data collected by Gilligan suggests that although the empirical connection between semantic and non-semantic null subject is strong, the connection between those and other two properties is tenuous at best. The appearance of spurious connection is precisely the statistical effect that one would expect from the small biased sample that usually emerges from studies in the generative literature. A small sample means that it is highly likely that other possible types exist outside the sample. Also, the additional syntactic parameters proposed to accommodate the types inside the sample are highly unlikely to correctly capture the range of variants tested in the truly representative sample. For example, for Paradra, a heavily studied phenomenon of the 22 languages which have been analyzed for Paradra within the generative framework, 15 are Indo-European, 4 more are Afro-Asiatic, and only 3 fall outside Europe and Northern Africa. Another important observation is that biconditional universals fare more poorly than simple conditionals, as can be seen in table 3.3. The predominance of implicational universal over biconditional universals is widely found in typological research. Few biconditional universals survive the examination of a large balanced sample. Formal approaches have incorporated competing motivations into a recent theory, Optimality Theory. Okay, the formal approaches have incorporated competing motivations, which we read about them, into a recent theory, which is Optimality Theory. In Optimality Theory, an input or underlying phonological or syntactic structure is allowed to generate an indefinite number of output or surface structure. Actual phonological word forms or syntactic constructions in the language through any sort of formal derivational process. Okay, you should know about the optimality theory, which through that we have an input and we are allowed to generate an indefinite number of output. The output structure are compared to the input structures in terms of range of potentially competing principles or constraints, analogous to competing motivation in typological analysis. The constraints are ranked in a specific order in language, but the order can vary from language to language. The correct output structure is predicted to be the one that violates the fewest and lowest ranked constraint. Cross-linguistic variation is the result of the different ranking of the same universal constraint. Dear student, this paragraph is very important and you should know that. Maybe I ask you this matter in your final exam, and even it is important for your summarization. Therefore, I want to repeat it again because this paragraph is very important and I want you to know that. Here we talked about the optimality theory, and here we put the competing motivation in optimality theory. Okay. Therefore, this paragraph is very important. You should know that. Here, in optimality theory, we have an input, which is underlying phonological or syntactic structure. Maybe for your final exam, I want you to select the best definition of optimality theory through this competing motivation. We should know that. In optimality theory, we have an input or underlying phonological or syntactic structure, which is allowed to generate an indefinite number of output, like actual phonological word forms or syntactic instruction in the language, through any sort of formal derivational process. The output structures are compared to the input structures in terms of a range of potentially competing principles or constraints. Analogous to competing motivation in typological analysis. The constraints are ranked in a specific order in a language, but the order can vary from language to language. The correct output structure is predicted to be the one that violates the fewest and lowest ranked constraint. Cross-linguistic variation is the result of the different ranking of the same universal constraint. You should know that this is important. A simple phonological example of an optimality theory analysis can contrast the expression of bed in English as bed and in Dutch a bed as bed. Keiger employs two universal constraints, which given in 18a. A voice which is not correct, which is violated. Voice coda is not allowed in English. Obstruent must not be voiced in coda position. Coda means at the end of the word, after the last syllable peak, after the last vowel. Ident IO. It means that the specification for the feature voice of an input segment must be preserved in its output correspondence. Ident stands for identical. It means that the input and output should have the same features. Two relevant outputs are generated for both Dutch and English, bed and bed. In fact, all possible output structures are generated, but only these two are relevant for the constraint in 18. In Dutch, voice coda outranked identical IO, so the output bit is valued more highly than output bit, because in this language, in Dutch, the voice coda, we can have a voice coda. It means that the D is not allowed in this language at the end of the word, but T, which is voiceless, is allowed. In English, on the other hand, identical IO outrank voice coda, so the output bit is valued more highly than output bit, because another matter is important in English. Thus, the difference in the phonological system of the two languages is attributed to the difference in the language-specific ranking of the two universal constraints. Optimality theory introduces competing motivations into generative grammar. However, the model of grammatical structure and the way competing constraints operate in OT or optimality theory is quite different from competing motivation in typology. In OT, the constraints relate an underlying input phonological or syntactic structure with an output phonological or syntactic structure. Formal derivational process subsumed under a general operation called generative derive the output structure from the input structure. In typology, the motivations relate the external functions or phonetic structure to the internal morphosyntactic or phonological structure. No derivational processes are found in typological analysis. Only a direct mapping between linguistic form and external function or phonetic substance. Okay, here you can see in this paragraph the differences between competing motivation in optimality theory and in typology, which in optimality theory the competing motivation they have a derivational form and they are related, the output related to the underlying form, but in typology the motivation are related to the external functional or phonetic structure, to the internal morphosyntactic or phonological. But here we don't have derivational processes in typology, and here we have just a direct mapping between the linguistic form and external function or phonetic substance. In optimality theory, the constraints are ranked. Okay, you should know that. Here we mentioned the differences between the competing motivation in optimality theory and in typology. In optimality theory, the constraints are ranked, and the ranking varies from languages to other language. The ranking determines which forms actually occur in the language. Thus, in optimality theory, the ranking makes the constraints part of the grammatical conventions of the language. In typology, the motivations are not ranked. Okay, here you can see the differences, another difference. You should know these differences, dear student. These paragraphs are important. The ranking determines which forms actually occur in language. It is in optimality theory. Thus, in optimality theory, the ranking makes the constraint part of the grammatical conventions of the language. But in typology, the motivation are not ranked. You should know that. Also, they may be weighted. Motivation has only an indirect relationship to grammatical convention. The motivations are functional in a region and hence are present to an equal degree for all speakers at all times. There is no difference in ranking of motivations from one language to another. Actually occurring forms are conventionally specified in the language, and cross-linguistic variation represents the range of at least partially motivated structure. Convention is partially attributed as well as partially motivated. The typological model allows for greater cross-linguistic variation than the optimality model. However, the OT model is forced to accommodate more variation than its apparently restrictive model allows. It does so by adding further complexity to the ranking relationship, allowing different ranking of constraints depending on which features or segments they apply to, allowing equally ranked constraints, allowing degrees of violations of constraints, allowing conjunction of constraints that are ranked separately from the individual constraint. Also, there are no restrictions on how to formulate constraints. This leads to overlapping constraints definitions for individual derivations. For example, Kager gives a more detailed analysis of Dutch, which is bad using voiced coda as in 18a, and overlapping constraint VOP, no obstruent must be voiced, which are independently ranked in the same derivation. The typological model makes an additional prediction language type that satisfy more competing motivation or more heavily weighted competing motivation will be cross-linguistically more frequent. Dear student, you should know them. They are important and you should know them for the differences between this competing motivation in typology and in the optimality theory. The typological model makes an additional prediction: language types that satisfy more competing motivations or more heavily weighted competing motivations will be cross-linguistically more frequent. Optimality theory, at least in the form described in Kager 1999, cannot make such prediction because grammatical structures are determined by a language-specific ranking of constraints and not a universal procedure of counting or weighting constraint. Hence, optimality theory in its present form doesn't account for this good distribution of structural types in the world's languages. Dear students, you should know the matters which we talked about the competing motivation in optimality theory and in typology, and some terms which are related to the typology. Okay, the conclusion of this chapter. The concept of an implicational universal has had its greatest impact in the area of word order. You should know that. About 28 of the implicational universal are about the word order. Also, broader theoretical concepts have been invoked to account for typological patterns of word order. Implicational universal remains a basic unit of typological analysis. Implicational universals of word order illustrate the basic element of the typological method in their simplest form. The first step is the enumeration of logically possible language types by the structural parameters involved, illustrated by the tetrachoric tables. Dear student, we explained them before in the previous session in details, but here we read the core matters and summarization of that matters. Okay, the second step is discovery of the empirical distribution of attested or untested types, illustrated by pattern of gap in tetrachoric table. The third step is developing a generalization that won't restrict variation in language type without eliminating it, like allow for the various attested types by excluding the unattested type, and second, reveals a relationship between otherwise logically independent grammatical parameters, in this case, the implicational relationship. Dear student, you should know these steps. These three steps are very important, you should know that. Typologists from Greenberg onward have observed more far-reaching relationship between the word order parameters such as harmony and dominance than could be captured by simple implicational universals. The final step in the analysis is to seek deeper, possibly external explanation for the relationship. Here, a central element of typological theory are competing motivation analysis. Competing motivation are deeper factors that motivate grammatical structure but which compete with each other. Much cross-linguistic variation is the result of competing motivation. Competing motivation can explain not only the distribution of attested and unattested types across the world's languages, but also the proportional distribution of different attested types, as well as the relatively rare exception to the typological universal. Okay, dear student, please pay attention to the important matters, and this conclusion is very important. You should know the steps which here we mentioned, and you should know the functional the competing motivation in typology and in optimality theory. Please give its task by summarize this session, and you should know the important matters for your final exam. If you had any question, you can ask me through the WhatsApp. Thank you.